welcome to today's event, Harnessing Innovative Tools of Accountability in Pursuit of International Justice. My name is Ariela Blätter, and I'm the President and CEO of Women in International Security. Women in International Security, or WIIS, is a non-governmental organization that promotes gender equality through advancing women's leadership through advancing women as leaders in the international peace and security sector. For over 35 years, our global organization has supported professional growth opportunities for women, led research projects and policy engagements, and nurtured a community of powerful security advocates, expert leaders, and mentors. Our network spans nearly 50 countries across 6 continents and includes 15,000 in our network, committed to closing the gender gap worldwide. If you're not already a member, I encourage you to go to our website at www.wiisglobal.org. Today's discussion comes at a very difficult time, and I want to acknowledge that. From ongoing wars in Israel and Gaza, Ukraine and Tigray, to systematic atrocities occurring in Darfur and Burma, the victims, the survivors, need justice and accountability, and failure is not an option. I don't need to inform this audience that women and girls are especially vulnerable during each and every one of these conflicts. We've seen evidence that points to rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence being used as a tactic of war. And while the International Criminal Court recognizes these crimes and strides are being made, prosecution remains elusive. And why? Documentation remains a challenge. A lack of evidence often hinders attempts to prosecute these crimes, especially in the cases of rape and sexual violence. However, the implementation of new technologies has played an increasingly important role in collecting evidence in a way that prioritizes the safety of survivors. And I do want to call out some of the bright lights that we've seen regarding technology. For example, the US government's CSO Bureau's Conflict Observatory leverages geospatial technologies to document atrocities in Ukraine and Sudan. I won't preempt the wonderful activities and initiatives that I know our panelists from the State Department's Office of Global Criminal Justice will be telling us about today. There are many initiatives from the civil society space. Just one I'll mention, the Physicians for Human Rights launched the Medicap app, which allows medical professionals to document evidence of sexual violence. The app securely transmits the data to police and legal professionals to begin prosecuting these crimes. Promoting justice and accountability requires innovation and creativity, but it doesn't have to be new. Yesterday, for example, the US Department of Justice charged 4 Russian military affiliates with war crimes for acting illegally in Ukraine by using a 30-year-old statute, making it a crime to subject Americans to torture and inhumane treatment during war. Our event today will look at both of these new and historic tools at our disposal, focusing on their effectiveness and the different ways they can be utilized in the pursuit of justice and accountability. I want to recognize our partner for this event, the Embassy of Liechtenstein in Washington, D.C. Liechtenstein is a vocal advocate for advancing gender inequality and is steadfast in its commitment to international justice and the International Criminal Court. WIIS has enjoyed working alongside the embassy for over 6 years, and I am looking forward to many future collaborations together. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Mr. Georg Sparber, Ambassador of the Principality of Liechtenstein to the United States. Prior to becoming the ambassador in 2021, Mr. Sparber held the position of Deputy Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations in New York. His portfolio included disarmament, peace and security, and political issues. I turn it over to you, Mr. Ambassador, and I look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, dear Ariela. Thank you all for being here today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event on accountability for the worst crimes under international law, and more importantly, of course, pathways to justice. I'm very grateful to our good partners at WIIS for hosting us again on these topics. We've had many good discussions on this in the past, and certainly do believe that we need to keep a strong focus on these questions. Today is going to be a further contribution to that. This has been a priority of Liechtenstein for as long as I can think, and the aspect we're looking at in particular today, innovation in finding pathways to justice, does resonate very strongly, I'm sure, with all of us. In theory, of course, the need for innovation would be fairly limited when it comes to mechanisms for international criminal justice. At the center, you've mentioned it, Ariela, we have the International Criminal Court covering the atrocity crimes that we know and the crime of aggression. Give it the jurisdiction it needs and the resources it needs, and there is a universal tool to bring the perpetrators of the worst crimes under international law to justice. Very importantly, and central among them, of course, sexual and gender-based violence as a weapon of war. The reality is, of course, different. The court is not yet universal, although we're making important progress towards that end. The veto in the Security Council makes referrals impossible today in any special interest situation for the permanent members of the Council. The resources are keeping the court at a harmfully low plane, something we hope will change for the better at the Assembly of State Parties that's currently underway in The Hague. At the same time, there continues to be a strong call for accountability in the international community. Look at the decisions the UN General Assembly has taken on Syria, for example, on Myanmar, on other situations. Look also in particular at the consistently low number of opponents to those justice efforts. And this is, I believe, where innovation comes in, where we have seen progress with, for example, the IIIM on Syria or the IIM mechanism on Myanmar. This is only limited progress, of course, and more is needed in these and also other situations. And of course, in many of these situations, we now have a sort of a patchwork of mechanisms and justice efforts, and we need to ensure efficiency and complementarity, but we can also innovate through these mechanisms. For example, in sexual and gender-based violence, we've seen important new standards emerge in criminal prosecution, in survivor-sensitive evidence gathering, in proceedings and compensation. I believe just a couple of days ago in The Hague, the ICC has presented a new policy on gender-based crimes, and that's certainly also something I look forward to discussing with the experts today. It's encouraging to see that innovation in justice will make its way through the limitations politics imposes on these efforts. And we have to be innovative again when it comes to ensuring accountability for Russian leadership and its decision to wage an illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. There can be no protection from prosecution for the breach of peace, and we do hope to make soon progress on the International Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. With this, I very much look forward to listening to the experts on their ideas for innovative approaches to justice. Thank you again all for being here in the room and online for this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for those excellent remarks. And I want to thank you, of course, and the Principality of Liechtenstein for your incredible, staunch commitment to the International Criminal Court, and also call out the commitment and leadership around the Assembly of State Parties, and particularly to leadership around the crime of aggression. I also just want to turn to my colleague, Dr. Karin Johnston, introduce her, as she will be the moderator for this panel, and she will in turn introduce our panelists for today. Kara.
Thank you, Ariela. It is my pleasure now to introduce our panelists. We are joined today by Jennifer Glaudemans on my left. She is the Senior Advisor in the Office of Global Criminal Justice in the U.S. Department of State. And to her left is Andrea Gittleman. She is the Policy Director at the Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And to her left is Wei Wei Nu. She is the founder and executive director of Women's Peace Network, and we are very happy to have all of you here to discuss this. And at times where these issues and the discussion, I think, will have real relevance moving forward. So, if you're interested in learning more about the fascinating work of our panelists, please have a look at their bios, which we are going to add to the chat at the moment. And so we are now going to move to our panel discussions, and I'm going to pose a series of questions to our panelists before we move on to Q&A section. And if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them by using the Q&A function. And don't mind me, I'm not checking my email. I'll be checking your questions to the panelists as we move on. So thank you. And I would like to, I guess, begin with a broader question for all of our panelists to set the stage for the detailed discussion to come. And it has to do with all that we're witnessing, this unparalleled number of violent conflicts and wars that have generated extreme human rights abuses and atrocities. Hence, again, the importance and urgency of our topic today. From your perspective, do we have enough tools? Do we have the right tools to see that those responsible for atrocities are held accountable? Where do you see the most urgent challenges at the moment? And if I may start with Jennifer on my left.
Yes, thank you, Ariela, ambassadors, Sparber, and Karin. Thank you for inviting me to be with you today, and it's an honor to be on this panel with these amazing women. I think Ambassador Van Schok, who heads our office, has said that the globe is increasingly united around the imperative of justice and accountability for the commission of international crimes. And yes, we are seeing, a moment of crisis, but I think one of the things to take heart from is that there seems to be a growing united commitment to pursuing accountability. The last decade has witnessed incredible innovations in the field of international justice. The institutional framework for criminal accountability is becoming more decentralized and multipolar. And this is a result of an evolution that began not just recently and out of these immediate crises. This evolution, perhaps you could even say, began at Nuremberg, but it certainly began with the ad hoc tribunals, for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The creation of the ICC evolved from that, the hybrid courts in Cambodia, Senegal, and the HEP in Colombia, the nascent process in the Gambia. These are all evolving processes as well. And the independent investigative mechanisms mandated to collect, preserve, and analyze information and evidence that could be used in accountability processes. Do you want me to make this short and go into things later, or I wasn't sure how
we can go into it a little bit later.
Okay.
We'll just make some.
Sure.
And Wei, if I could ask you to sort of ask your question, where do you see the most urgent challenges now in the moment on these issues?
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnston, and the Ambassador Sparber and the Embassy and WIIS for organizing this important discussions alongside the ASP happening in New York. Yes, we have seen incredible development when it's come to accountability and justice processes in Burma, for Burma. However, we have such a long way to go to achieve access to justice for the survivors and victims. Meanwhile, we have also seen a lot of shortcomings along these processes, ongoing processes that include access to these mechanisms and bodies by the community members or civil society organizations, even like us who have been working, documenting, monitoring situations for years. There is no coherent or clear path to access to any of this mechanisms. So we feel like there is a lot of shortcoming and gaps between those ongoing processes and what the community on the ground and civil society on the ground. And I think that's one of the most challenging process or experience we're having today. Because although we see a lot of these processes have developed due to the active involvement and advocacy of the civil society organizations within and outside. However, when they are out there, it feels like it's a bit far from the community, and it's a bit far from the civil society themselves. So I think that is one of the major shortcomings that we're seeing, and I think there is a way to minimize or there was a way to mitigate that processes, hopefully in the future as we talk about these issues as more. And secondly, around the coherent documentations and investigative processes, although not only for the case of Rohingya, but also as a Burma, there are so many organizations and individuals obtain incredible documents and evidences. However, these documents and evidences are not, we're not sure that what standard, which mechanisms are looking for, and how can we utilize these evidences for the prosecutions and accountability purposes. So I think, in short, if there is a kind of standard for documentations, that expectation that community or civil society can understand, so that these documentations can be effectively used for the investigations and accountability prosecutory processes, so that the case can be more effective. So now that we have fear, a lot of the experts sitting on these bodies, they have so much knowledge and they have so much experiences and techniques that they use. However, there is a gap between the understanding of the crimes on the ground and what is happening, and the experts the knowledge expert that they have, because a lot of them lack contextual understanding or the nuances on the ground, as well as details commissions of such crimes under different international laws. And lastly, I think it's around the frustrations among the communities around not having a holistic accountability process, or especially when it's come to criminal prosecutions. Although we have IIM and we have case investigations at the International Criminal Court, as well as different universal jurisdiction cases underway. However, there's a frustrations among the communities that these investigations and these processes are still quite limited. How do we actually prosecute the crime as the whole entirety of the crimes in a way that is holistic? So having envisioning a holistic court is important. However, as a community and for the people of Burma, we appreciate any effort that perhaps in the future can lead to such holistic justice processes, not only for the criminal prosecutions, but also we're looking toward beyond criminal prosecution, that the criminal prosecution that can open path to a more broader civil liabilities and transitional justice process as a whole.
Thank you. And Andrea, the right tools, the needed tools, the challenges?
Sure. It's a big question, but just first I wanted to echo my panelists in thanking Women in International Security and the Embassy of Liechtenstein for organizing this discussion. And I think my co-panelists said a lot. I think in terms of tools, just one area where I think there's a gap to be filled is looking at prosecuting crimes against humanity. I mean, there are efforts underway now to have a Crimes Against Humanity treaty, and that I think will fill this important gap. Genocide, war crimes are codified. There's treaty law about those crimes, and so this treaty I think holds promise. And there are discussions about the loopholes in U.S. law about being able to prosecute crimes against humanity in this country. So in terms of tools, I think those are two that I think there might be efforts underway, but so far those are gaps in terms of accountability for mass atrocities. But I think the bigger and perhaps harder question is not just the tools, but then what challenges are still, even if we had the best tools, if we had the full spectrum there are perennial challenges, and I think my co-panelists touched on this already a little bit, but the lack of political will or changing political will. The Embassy of Liechtenstein and Ambassador Sparber done so much in terms of keeping up the march for international justice. But I think it's also human for so many people to see new crises around the world, and you kind of lose the thread of victims and survivors from past of mass atrocity. And in so many of these contexts, the road to justice is long. I think when we've seen successful efforts to hold perpetrators accountable, this comes after years or sometimes decades. And so you're talking about political will not only for a moment and dedication of financial resources and diplomatic efforts, not only for a short time, but really over a long period. And often it's victim communities and survivors and civil society who keep that pressure going, but they themselves need the resources to do that. I think big picture, we're also seeing an erosion of norms about mass atrocities and the importance of international justice. And I think everyone who's hopefully tuning into this event is really dedicated to this cause. But I think something that concerns me is that we kind of become numb to the seriousness of these crimes. Mass atrocities, genocide, these are scandals, and they deserve not only is there the legal obligation, but really this moral imperative to promote accountability. And I'm worried that the more we see crisis after crisis, that we just start accepting some level of impunity, and I think that would be really wrong. And then finally, just to build on what Weiwei was mentioning about this gap between advances in the innovation, which I think holds a lot of promise, and the experience of survivors and what this means in terms of their what they see. I think often victim groups, survivors of mass atrocities, they might engage with some of these mechanisms. They might provide information. They might get involved in organizing or do advocacy efforts, but at the end of the day, their needs are still so great. And I think often some of the demands that are most touching to them, I mean, they care about justice often, but also humanitarian needs. And just thinking about the Rohingya community today and just the growing gap between resources available and the needs of victims when it comes to justice, but also the justice of being able to have what you need to move forward with your life. And I think those gaps just tend to grow greater, even as there are a lot of promising developments on the legal or the justice fronts.
I was particularly interested in these issues about this sense of having there been such a significant shift in the framework for international justice and accountability. And I wondered, is it part of it, could it be also that for the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the length of how long it takes to prosecute, how incredibly expensive it is, how difficult it is, did that contribute to the sense that there are now all these different levels that have developed? I mean, these changes in the structure is what I'm interested in, and is this in response? Is it moving in the right direction?
Yeah. Well, I think going back to what I was mentioning earlier about this, it's an evolutionary process, and all of these UN-based investigative mechanisms, and everyone's familiar with the one for Syria, for Myanmar, and UNITAD, but there's also OHCHR has accountability projects for North Korea and Sri Lanka. So there's that, but again, the origin of these mechanisms are sort of twofold. One, from commissions of inquiry or fact-finding missions, but also from civil society, the people on the ground documenting what is happening. And there has been an evolution in the dynamic between all of these groups from a technological point of view of being able to, again, one of the very important things is can phones be used in a more safe and secure way? Can information be stored in secure cloud systems? So there is this technological evolution in the actual area of documentation, but there is also the issues that are mentioned in terms of the interaction. And I think one of the things that is underway in discussion is, should we have one unified investigative mechanism and not ad hoc? This is not something the US government has an opinion on yet. It is something that is out there being discussed. And again, looking for efficiency, not recreating the wheel. And hopefully these organizations can learn about how to better engage with the communities on the ground that they're working with. And then again, finally, something that always gets forgotten until the end a lot of times is, how do we want to archive? How do we want to save this? And it sounds like, oh, it's not an urgent thing, but at the end of the day, it does. The documentation itself has an evolutionary process from saying, yes, crimes are happening, to maybe supporting accountability and holding someone criminally liable, to then becoming the historical legacy to never forget about what had happened. And so, yeah.
So, and in keeping with that question, you've mentioned what has been happening and what the situation in Myanmar is. So there are different then levels, for example, not just from the UN level, the international community level, but also in some domestic national courts and other options, perhaps. And so the question, I guess, and realizing that for the Rohingya, there are no sort of fair sort of remedies inside the country. So there have to be sort of looking outward to try to understand what kind of sort of pathways for justice that you can have. And so are those, for example, in Argentina or in Germany, these alternative kind of ways of trying to bring about the prosecution for those who are responsible for these atrocities?
Yeah, indeed, that's correct. And but I'd like to touch a few of the points before that. One around the I was just in New York last week and until yesterday. I was in a different consultations around different ESB side events, including one on the Crimes Against Humanity treaty, as well as the standing investigative mechanisms, establishing a standard investigative mechanisms. And I find those are particularly SIM is incredibly innovative idea. I remember when Burma case, when we had atrocity crimes for decades, and when it escalated in 2012 leading up to 2017, it was extremely hard for talk about accountability and to really look for any mechanisms for investigations or justice, including the advocacy around commissions of inquiry. It was extremely difficult even to mention those words. And I think for a lot of the crises happening today, such mechanisms, innovative tools can be really a body or a system that would not only enable these crimes to be investigated, but also it can help or it can work as a preventative tools for the atrocity crimes. It can warn the perpetrators not to really commit such a heinous crime or escalate such atrocity crimes in different contexts. So, I just want to put out this one, and I find it fascinating to get involved in these processes. And also, when it comes to Crimes Against Humanity treaty, it's the same thing for us, because when we are talking about genocide, nobody want to even use or hear the word genocide, right? Although genocide is happening, but if we have a Crimes Against Humanity tool that can be utilized at the national level, and I think that can also serve as a more preventative tool, but also it will expedite the access to justice. There will be more options for us to choose, right? To be able to get into the justice processes in one way or another way, while genocide convention can be a little difficult to touch, or even the advocacy around genocide can be different, difficult. So I just want to put out there. But when it's come to the cases we have now in Burma, for Burma and for Rohingya, one thing that I'm seeing is, in addition to what I have mentioned earlier, it's the lack of resources for these processes and mechanisms, as well as for the community members to be able to advance this in a way to expedite the access to justice, or to have effective processes. For all the cases as we see, it's extremely difficult, not only for the universal jurisdiction cases, but also even the court, ICC itself, and other processes. There's very limited resources for the Burma case, where else some other case can be, you can see more resources could be available. So I think one bigger issue that we need to think about is how do you address inequality between the cases when it comes to international accountability processes, right? How do you actually provide more equitable resources to all the cases, so that they can all be they can all have access to justice the way they need it, and these processes can be more effective and expedited. And lastly, around the communities, leaderships and ownerships around these processes, from documentation to archiving to the community-led justice processes, there's little to none for the Rohingya. So I hope that, I remember a few years ago, there was an organization, big legal organizations from international, from abroad, London or somewhere. And they came to talk to us to collaborate around the documentations on human sexual violence. And the documentation models they were proposing to us is that we're going to be helping document what's happening, or we're going to be providing our information, the information that we have, then it will be stored in an archive that they only have access to. So I think in long run, yes, it can be effective for immediate accountability processes or court cases. However, in the long run, the community need to we believe community need to have ownership of these documentations. What happened to them? How they're going to deal with it in the next 50 years or 100 years? How do we remember? And those things should be considered in the processes and resource allocations and programming and all of it, because at the end of the day, it is the community who deserved justice and who need to move forward, recover, and rehabilitate themselves and prevent such crimes in the future. And I think donors, countries, and international community working in this issue, I think it's all incredibly important to keep in mind that how do you give access to the community? How do you ensure communities' ownership or agency is not deprived? And how do you enhance them? I think that's important thing.
I would like to just ask one last question to our panel, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Please, again, just send in your questions and we will collect them. And we now talk about resources, right? Some of the problems, what resources are needed to ensure, the documentation efforts have a survivor-centric approach. And we can even, in this context, we know that women and children constitute the vast, majority of victims in these conflicts. And, what advances have been made in integrating and resourcing, like these mechanisms for obtaining accountability on, conflict-related sexual and gender-based crimes in view of, our discussions so far.
Sure. On the resources point, I feel like having these tools be more responsive to the needs of victims and survivors, it doesn't require a ton of more resources, but I do appreciate when governments and donors are making that part of their process. I think that's important, and they can lead the way. But I do think that there's a lot that can be done just in shifting how we think about some of these accountability efforts. And Wei, I think, said it very well. There's no need to really start from scratch. There's the Murad Code, especially when it comes to documenting crimes of sexual and gender-based violence. But in general, just this kind of dismantling of the idea that researchers and documenters or legal experts coming from outside, that they have the capacity and the expertise and that the people who they would be talking to, victims and survivors, they have evidence that has to be, kind of gathered. Just kind of breaking that understanding about how documentation is done or about how justice processes move forward. I mean, there's tremendous capacity just in the case of Burma that we've been talking about, like a civil society that for decades has been documenting human rights violations and is intensely organized and is very good at what they do, and just understanding that there's capacity there. And then as Weiwei said, also knowing that decisions about information and what happens to it is not something that's done by donors, it's not done by governments, but really people who own the information should have control over that. I think the easy thing to do is to say that justice efforts should be survivor-centered, of course. I think everyone says that, but then I feel like when you get into the details, it looks very different about what that means. I mean, every survivor will have different opinions about what happens to their information, and so thinking that there's one approach is often difficult. Within survivor communities, there are voices who might be marginalized, or maybe outsiders, journalists are speaking with people who might represent part of the community, not others. And so I feel like for outsiders who might have trouble understanding a very complicated situation, it's easy to essentialize the stories of the community and kind of take information in a way that makes it easy to retell, or and then when it comes to informing what justice looks like, kind of picking the voices that kind of match, whether it's the will of governments or donors. So I think just being wide-eyed about what it means to be survivor-centered. And I think something that we've seen in terms of the Skjodt Thought Center in places where there's often a lot of interest and energy and maybe resources going into documentation in certain places, that the same people have to tell their stories over and over, and it's really traumatizing, and it does no good for who. So I think taking a step back to understand, what are these various efforts? Is my work necessary here? Is this work important? Is this helpful? And really the best people to answer that are the very people you're talking to. So I think that's something just to keep in mind. But if these kinds of efforts are welcomed by the survivors, I think it's important to think about building kind of coalitions, and for donors and governments to think about creating environments where people can come together and work, and trying to make sure that voices who might otherwise have been excluded can be brought into the fold, and so that people can talk to a broader society, a broader cross-section. And I think when it comes to what Weiwei mentioned about giving you information and then it kind of goes into a box and you don't know what happens to it, that having a justice process that's survivor-centered doesn't mean just at the outset it's survivor-centered. You ask people, do consultations about what people want in one particular moment, but it's something that extends throughout the course of a justice process. And I think when it comes to survivors, their security situation might change rapidly. And so, you might give informed consent at one point, but someone might want to change or revoke their consent. What if their security situation changes drastically? Mm-hmm. And they should know how to go about that. Or, okay, I said you could use this information for this public advocacy effort, but not for criminal prosecution. Well, now, there's been a coup and now I'm at a different kind of risk, and now I want to change it. So making sure that there's a sense of longevity to that conversation. And just as a story, the director of our center has been doing a lot of work in Iraq and has spoken to a number of different survivors of mass atrocities, including members of the Yazidi community, wrote a report, did advocacy and legal analysis, and then went back and years later spoke with community and spoke with a woman a couple of months ago and handed her the report and talked about how her information was used. And she said, no one ever comes back. She said, you're the first person who came back. And that's a little bit sad, I think, because she had talked to so many people. And so just getting the sense of, it's not survivor-centered at the start, but what happens to this information? How does that go on? And I think in Burma in particular, but in also a lot of context, survivor-centered means that groups of survivors, but also broader civil society that can maybe represent the demands of survivors, really should be in the driver's seat in the long term, deciding about what justice efforts look like, what different decisions can be made. This is all done for the benefit of this community, and so they should be in the driver's seat all along the way. I'll stop there.
Can I just add to some of this? it doesn't even have to be new to address some of these concerns, because you can go back to the extraordinary chambers of the courts in Cambodia, which has a very innovative tool that you do not see in Western courts or in the international courts, and that is civil parties to criminal cases. And so it is a, you know, in the field of international criminal law, it was a novel element, but again, not every victim was a party, but it was a way to have victim and survivor led at the trial, you know, again, that through that process, and they had their own attorney representations. And so I think that, you know, we don't always have to look forward, we can also look back, because it's a very interesting model that I don't think gets enough attention in the West. And then another thing that we are trying to incorporate in our language is not just victim survivor led, but also trauma informed. And I think that sounds like a buzzword, but what it goes to is what we were talking about, not wanting to re-traumatize people. And it is unfortunately still too common of a problem. And I think one of the innovations we've tried to do in the US government with some of our European allies with Ukraine was, again, when these crises happens, a lot of times there is a flood of efforts to document, and you end up, you know, with the problem Wei mentioned of lots of people talking and re-traumatization. And so the United States with some European allies formed an accountability alliance so that we could coordinate our efforts in supporting the Ukrainian prosecution and investigation, so we weren't stepping over each other's toes doing the same thing. And, you know, perhaps that might be, again, this is not across the board, it's not an internationally agreement, but it is a way of, particularly the funders and donors of documentation efforts, to get together and to try to avoid and ameliorate some of these problems that recur over and over again.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Or one question that I think really sort of speaks to the discussion as we just mentioned, is this importance of the crime of aggression. And if I may add, again, in 2012, Liechtenstein was the first state to ratify the amendments to the Rome Statute of the ICC to activate the court's jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. And so that's why I'm particularly pleased that we are having a conversation in which we can try to address these shifts, particularly as you mentioned with Ukraine, that there is a recommendation supported by the United States to establish some sort of internationalized national courts to try to push forward the prosecution under the crimes of aggression, if I understand it. So do you see this, how do you see this advancing these efforts along those lines? And, you know, would it also address accountability for, you know, conflict-based sexual crime, violence and sexual-based crimes as well? I'm not a lawyer, so that would be sort of my question to the panel. And to
Sure. So we in the department are working on the crime of aggression as one of the critical pathways to justice for the people of Ukraine. This is critical, as the invasion itself is, of course, the precursor to the atrocities that we have seen since then. We are supportive of efforts to investigate and prosecute the crime of aggression. We will stay actively engaged in the core group, working to devise a modality to prosecute this international crime. And some in the core group are putting forward new ideas all the time. I think this is part of the evolution process, is churning as we speak. We have been clear the United States supports the development of a special tribunal in the form of an internationalized court that is rooted in Ukraine's judicial system, with extensive international elements to secure support and legitimacy. Our G7 partners also support exploring the development of this type of tribunal. That said, we appreciate the efforts of others to think creatively on how to confront this crime, bearing in mind the tricky legal and geopolitical challenges to implement it. I can share with you some of our recent contributions to the international effort to build a strong case on this crime of aggression. As many of you may know, the United States, through the Department of Justice, appointed an experienced federal prosecutor, Jessica Kem, to serve as the United States Special Prosecutor for the crime of aggression, and our representation to the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, also called the ICPA. To build on this deployment, the Department of State is contributing $1 million to the ICPA. This contribution is in line with our commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and to promote comprehensive justice and accountability for the international crimes being committed against Ukraine and its people. The ICPA will play a key role in investigations into Russia's war of aggression, allowing for prosecutors from across legal systems to work together to secure and share key evidence and pursue robust and independent investigations. This collaborative effort has come so far since the days of the full-scale invasion, and we encourage others to support this effort by contributing to and engaging with the ICPA going forward. But your question about gender-based crimes, those are separate from the aggression. Those are the secondary acts that would be in the other accountability measures. So the crime of aggression is unto itself, and the other things would follow from the other
Thank
acts.
you. Some comments on this progression and this discussion about pursuing crimes of aggression that have come up recently?
I mean, I think Jennifer said it very well. Just to add, I think something I mentioned earlier about the erosion of norms, I mean, just reaffirming the crime of aggression and that it is punishable, I think, and having this kind of wellspring of support for accountability for aggression, I think is really important, and maybe will stem that tide against the erosion of that norm.
I mean, just to echo, I think, at this time of our age, where you see different forms of atrocities and violence occurred within and beyond the territorial countries, and I think this is a time that the morale of justice and tools for the accountability should be discussed even more than ever. There's so many perspectives to it, and people are lost in those discussions, which side we should be siding or so and so, right? I think there should be more discussions about what does justice mean for all communities and humanity when it's whether using the crimes of aggressions or other tools that are underway and that are available. And I think people are blinded by the prejudices and biases, among themselves, and not seeing the kind of erosions of morals and norms when it's come to justice and accountability is heartbreaking for me as a global citizen, I guess.
And I think we've talked about legal accountability and legal mechanisms and technological tools, and it's not I don't think it really has a very good answer to my question of this very critical issue that Andrea brought up, which is changing political will and finding ways of preventing the erosion of these norms. So what in many, many other circumstances, this commitment to trying to change the political will to implement policies that are necessary to begin the process of modeling out justice and accountability. How do we begin to change that political will? How can we, work towards finding ways of avoiding this erosion of norms? I don't know. I don't know if you have an answer to that, but any ideas?
Well, I think in cases where there has been this long-term effort, the the fuel for generating political will has come from people who are most affected and people who have the longest term, probably most significant interest in justice being served. So I think what that means is that political will is not going to come from policymakers necessarily, but it'll come from voices from communities who have experienced harm and from close allies. And I think for donors and governments to kind of build into decision making about kind of this really long-term process and making sure that there's space for organizing, space for voices and policy circles from communities, I think that's really important, not in moments of crisis, but long term. So I think that's helpful. It only happens when there's funding and there's resources and support for that. But I do think what we've seen with Ukraine, I mean, like the crime of aggression is not new, and there's been advocates for advancing accountability for aggression for some time, and Ukraine just made it, I think, very clear why it's so important. But I think with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've also seen other advances in international justice, including within U.S. law, that I think are applicable elsewhere. And so when speaking with civil society groups from Ethiopia or from South Sudan, I mean, they say, this is important for us too. And, we also want this kind of fervor and attention. Yes, what's happening in Ukraine is extremely important. What's happening in South Sudan is as well. And so just making sure that some of the advances are going to touch many, many victims across the world. I think it will, but I think also making sure that the political will isn't driven only for particular populations, but can be a bit broader.
It's very important.
I was just going to add, Andrea is exactly right. It is the fuel is the survivors themselves, and I was reminded of the Senegal's prosecution of Chad's former dictator Hissène Habré. That took 20 years, and would have never happened if those survivors had not done what Winston Churchill advised, which was to never, 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 never give up. And I think that persistence is something that can blossom into this effort when they can build alliances with, and again, in that case, they built it with Human Rights Watch and Reed Brody, with a legal community that was from civil society that took on this case and decided to never, never, never give up. And then states states definitely got involved over the issue of the jurisdiction and to extradite or try, and it ended up in Senegal. But then the United States, I think, contributed $3 million to, or I don't remember the amount, but again, donor states then helped contribute to pay for that cost. It is an example of it being done. I don't want to minimize how difficult and challenging it is, but we do have examples of out there where the persistence and the dedication and the commitment to the pursuit of justice won out. And I think that, in the work we do in our office, every single day, I draw my inspiration from the WIIS of the world, and so it is this synergy that gets created.
Yeah, I guess in short, one most effective and practical ways to advance political will is providing support, allocated more support for the survivors and community-led initiative, and that can inform effectively to the wider international community and to the policymakers. So yeah, I guess that's
These, I think, really conceptualize and show us how important these issues are, and also bringing in, as you say, new examples, new ways of looking at things, as well as looking back, as you say, trying to look at old established tools, innovative tools that maybe in a different context could be used again. Do you have any final thoughts for our discussion? Anything to add?
If I may, I guess this is a time when we have so much other advantages other than community knowledge or experiences the community has. this is a time that there is a lot of awareness and understanding about the importance of justice and accountability, and also people throughout the world, throughout the continent, has learned each other's experiences in the past, the atrocities in 20th century and 21st centuries, as it is continued to happen. So knowledge and momentum and understanding, awareness is at a beginning point. Right, and in addition to that, we also have the advantage of the technology itself. Given back the Burma example, we have people like 20 years ago. Even in one country, communities in Burma are not connected. We don't know what happened in northern Burma and western Burma, in Rakhine State to Kachin State. We had no connections or no communication. We were not sure what was happening. Now the technology has brought us closer and created more connections and more tools for us to be able to stay connected and to advance our cause and to show solidarity and so and so, right? At the same time, it doesn't take long anymore to understand what's happening in one part of the country or one part of the continent and to other part, right? So I think we have such a age that connect people in a minute, in a way it has never been in the history. And today, not like, in Burma, we're witnessing what is happening as it has happened. At the same time, what is happening around the world, and why do we need more time or more effort to basically raise awareness or basically push for the accountability and end those atrocities and the crimes that has been happening in front of our eyes. So I think we have such an advantage age and period, and we need to utilize those advantages. And it was hard in the past to get information to take actions, but now it shouldn't be the case. With all of these advantages that we have, we should have a morale and courage as a people of the world, to be able to take actions wherever we can, whether we are in survivor communities or policymakers or government of the superpowers.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their exceptional comments and their insights. And thank you to all of you for joining us, and everyone also on Zoom. And thank you again for the Embassy of Liechtenstein for their support. And let us give a hand for our panel and for their, again, exceptional sort of contribution to our discussion. Thank you, Karin.